In the chaos of war, the expectation of total commitment weighs heavily on every soldier's psyche. It is a universal demand, but nowhere was it more ruthlessly enforced than by the Japanese Imperial Army during World War II. The Japanese Code of Honor, Bushido, demanded absolute loyalty to the emperor and the empire, pushing soldiers to fight not just until their last breath, but until the very last drop of blood. One of the most harrowing examples of this fanaticism was the phenomenon of the Japanese holdouts. These were soldiers who, after Japan's formal surrender in 1945, refused to accept that the war was over. They continued their campaigns of resistance, fighting in the dense jungles of the Pacific Islands. Shochi Yokoi, for instance, remained in hiding for nearly 3 decades, evading capture, believing his emperor would one day call him back to duty. It wasn't until 1972 that he was discovered on Guam, living off the land, utterly unaware that the war had ended. Then there was Hiro Onoda, who spent 29 years on the island of Lubang in the Philippines, convinced that the war was still raging and that his mission was to keep fighting. His return to Japan, after being ordered to surrender by his commanding officer, was an event that symbolized the tragic extremities of the Japanese Code of Conduct, a belief system that tied honor and duty to life and death itself. Yet this was not an isolated phenomenon. The Soviets, too, placed severe emphasis on unyielding loyalty and defiance in the face of insurmountable odds. During the German invasion, Joseph Stalin issued the infamous Order 270, which declared that Soviet soldiers were to fight to the death rather than surrender. The order's brutality extended to families, who were also held accountable for a soldier's desertion. If a soldier abandoned his post, his family members could be punished, sent to labor camps, or worse. The psychological toll on both soldiers and their families was immense, as the weight of survival was often coupled with the risk of the deepest betrayal, abandoning one's comrades, and by extension, one's country. Even the United States, generally seen as a bastion of individual freedoms, adhered to harsh military discipline. Private Eddie Slovic became the sole American serviceman executed for desertion during the war. In the autumn of 1944, Slovic, suffering from the pressures of war and facing the unimaginable terror of combat, deserted his unit. Though he was caught and warned, he abandoned his comrades a second time. His fate was sealed. General Eisenhower, determined to make an example of Slovic to maintain the morale of the troops, ordered his execution by firing squad. This shocking decision, the only one of its kind since the Civil War, cast a long shadow over the psychological landscape of the U.S. military. The lesson, painfully etched into the hearts of soldiers across the globe, was clear. Surrender was never an option. Whether by cultural code, brutal orders, or the crushing psychological burden of discipline, soldiers were expected to fight, no matter the cost. Discipline in wartime is the backbone of an army. It holds the fragile structure of military operations together in the face of chaos, and it demands absolute obedience. But what happens when that discipline is pushed to the extreme? What happens when soldiers are bound by rules so severe that they fear their own comrades as much as the enemy? Private Eddie Slovic's tragic end serves as a stark reminder of the power of military law and the psychological impact of living under its crushing weight. Slovic's story was not just about the cost of desertion, but the immense psychological strain that comes from living under the constant threat of punishment. As the only American soldier executed for desertion in World War II, Slovic became an example, his death symbolizing the iron grip of military law. But the tale of Slovic is not an anomaly. It serves as a chilling example of how far armies were willing to go to maintain order. It illustrates the extremes to which soldiers would be subjected in the name of discipline, whether it was facing death for desertion or enduring the mental anguish of knowing that even the slightest misstep could cost them their lives. What does it do to a soldier's mind to live in such a world of unrelenting discipline? It creates an atmosphere where fear reigns over reason, where duty outweighs humanity, and where every action is weighed against the possibility of death. The pressures of these extreme rules are felt not just on the battlefield, but in the very hearts of soldiers who must obey orders they may not fully understand. As the war raged on, there was one thing more precious than any weapon: morale. But how do you keep the morale of a soldier high in the face of unthinkable horrors? The answer was control. Control over every aspect of life, from what soldiers ate to who they danced with. Perhaps one of the most bizarre attempts to maintain control over the spirits of the troops came from Finland during the Winter War. In the midst of their struggle against the Soviet Union, the Finnish government enacted a rule that seems absurd today: a nationwide ban on public dancing. The idea was that allowing the soldiers any form of leisure or distraction would sap their morale, causing them to become less focused on the war effort. For years, Finns were forbidden to dance, even in private. This surreal rule was enforced with such fervor that the police raided secret dances, breaking up gatherings of soldiers seeking solace in music and movement. The psychological weight of living in a world where even the simple act of dancing was outlawed must have been staggering. For soldiers, it wasn't just the fear of death that weighed on them, but the suffocating feeling of being stripped of their humanity. In the madness of war, it was as though the leaders were trying to protect their soldiers by suffocating the very thing that made them human: joy. To dance was to escape, and in the eyes of the Finnish leadership, that escape could lead to defeat. So they enforced a rule that took away one of the few things that could provide relief from the horrors of war. While soldiers fought visible enemies on the front lines, they were also battling unseen foes. War was not just waged with bullets and bombs, but with secrets, disease, and the constant fear of betrayal. Censorship became an integral part of life for soldiers on both sides. The strict monitoring of mail, the requirement to write in approved languages, and the forbidding of any communication that could reveal military secrets made the simple act of sending a letter an act of defiance. Both the Axis and the Allies were adamant about preventing any information from slipping through the cracks, fearing that even the smallest piece of intelligence could turn the tide of the war. But there was another, even more insidious threat: disease. Typhus, dysentery, and other illnesses ran rampant through the ranks, killing as many soldiers as enemy forces did. Diseases spread quickly in the filthy, overcrowded conditions of the trenches and military camps. Hygiene became a matter of life and death, as the slightest lapse could lead to an outbreak. Soldiers were ordered to follow strict sanitation rules, but even then, the threat of disease loomed large. The psychological impact of living in such conditions was immense. Soldiers lived not just with the fear of battle, but with the constant dread of falling ill, of becoming another casualty to an unseen enemy. The rules surrounding hygiene were not just about cleanliness, they were a desperate attempt to keep men alive in a war that seemed to take everything from them. In war, identity becomes as fluid as the blood spilled on the battlefield. Soldiers are not just fighting for their lives, they are fighting for the identity of their nation, their people, and their beliefs. The rules that govern their appearance and conduct are as much about shaping their identity as they are about military strategy. Perhaps no one embodied this more than General George Patton, whose obsession with appearance was so intense that he issued an order requiring all of his troops to wear neckties in battle. Yes, even in the oppressive heat of Sicily, soldiers were expected to wear neckties. To many, this seemed absurd, a petty rule that had no place in the deadly business of war. But to Patton, it was a symbol of discipline and order. A soldier who cared for his appearance, he believed, would care for his duties just as meticulously. The Italian military, too, found itself caught in the tide of shifting allegiances. In 1943, after the fall of Mussolini, Italy switched sides, abandoning its alliance with Germany to join the Allies. This dramatic reversal threw soldiers into an identity crisis. Having once been loyal to Mussolini, many Italian soldiers found themselves fighting against the very same Germans they had once called allies. This shift in allegiance was more than just strategic, it was a psychological reckoning that reshaped the very core of Italian identity. As the war escalated, the very rules that soldiers had been forced to follow were bent, manipulated, and even broken by the high command. Military leaders, ever conscious of the stakes, were willing to engage in strategies that were as morally questionable as they were effective. One of the most glaring examples of this hypocrisy was Operation Paperclip, a secret U.S. program that involved recruiting former Nazi scientists for American military research. While the U.S. government publicly hunted Nazis as war criminals, it simultaneously made deals with the very individuals who had contributed to the Reich's weapons programs. The goal was simple: secure the technological advantage over the Soviets, no matter the moral cost. Similarly, the scorched earth tactics employed by both the Axis and the Allies showed the lengths to which armies would go to secure victory. Entire cities, factories, and resources were destroyed, not just to deny the enemy, but to demoralize and prevent any hope of resurgence. It was a rule of destruction, one that demanded soldiers destroy everything, even their own land, in the name of victory. The most profound rule that emerged from the ashes of World War II was one that transcended the battlefield: personal responsibility. The Nuremberg trials, which sought to hold Nazi war criminals accountable, forever altered the nature of military obedience. The defense of just following orders was deemed unacceptable. Soldiers, regardless of the orders they received, were held personally responsible for their actions. This landmark decision marked the end of an era in which military obedience was seen as a blanket excuse for atrocities. The psychological impact was far-reaching. Soldiers, once bound by a culture of absolute obedience, now had to grapple with the concept of individual moral responsibility. They were forced to confront the truth that, no matter how dire the circumstances, there were actions that were morally wrong, even in war. In the end, the most important lesson of all was this: that every soldier, regardless of rank or nation, must know when to resist an order that violates their moral compass. The ultimate rule of war was no longer simply about fighting. It was about knowing when to stop, when to surrender, and when to stand up for what is right, even in the face of overwhelming pressure.